All right, everybody, welcome back to our panel discussion. I'm glad it's Friday afternoon and everybody is still around. That's a good sign, I guess. And what we are going to do now for the next 1.5 hours is to try to wrap up what we learned within the last 2 days. And before I briefly introduce the panel, or I would just give you a glimpse of what we plan to do, and the idea is to wrap up what we learned within the last 2 days, especially along 3 questions that we pose. What are the topics discussed here have an impact or implications for planning, architecture, and politics, spatial politics, urban politics in particular? So to say, to bring or to translate the theory into practice. The second question we want to address is how can the understanding of the Anthropocene can contribute from spatial theory? And the third question into the dizzy heights of spatial theory would be vice versa. What does the diagnosis of the Anthropocene mean to further develop spatial theory? And we are going to do this by statements of our panelists, and then after each statement we get in conversation, and after that we are going to open up the discussion to the audience, because I think to wrap this topic up should be a common endeavor, so everybody is needed here. So to first start with the first question, as I said, we want to translate the theoretical reflections that we had today and yesterday, and try to translate them into practice. And I'm very glad that Philip Misselwitz is with us. Philip is also a colleague of ours at the CRC. He's also a professor at the Technical University at the Institute of Architecture at the Habitat Unit. He's an urban researcher, and he is also the co-founder of Bauhaus of the Earth, Bauhaus der Erde, in which you are particularly interested in how our cities can actively contribute to climate restoration. So I think you are the expert, the perfect expert to link the topics that we discussed the last 2 days into practice. And so I'm very much looking forward to hear your first statement, and then our 2 other panelists would react. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, and I would like to start by really saying that this is a fantastic conference, so congratulations to the organizers. It's been, I think, one of the best events the CRC has produced, and I'm really, really inspired and looking forward to how this will influence us in our further work. But what earned me the seat on this concluding panel, I think, was my role as practitioner, the fact that I have sort of left having been fully consumed by the TU for 10 years to co-set up Bauhaus Earth, which is now a 35 people strong sort of think tank and lab, and connecting climate scientists and economists, ecologists, but also architects, planners, designers like myself, driven by a sort of sense of urgency about what to do about the built environment, which I think is in the center of the Anthropocenic disturbance we are discussing. And I would like to just simply bring to the table a couple of figures that may not be so familiar in this circle. I really do think that cities and buildings are the most significant source of Anthropocenic environmental disturbance, not only because in cities we produce more than 70% of global energy, but also because cities and human-made structures have accumulated an anthropogenic mass of material, concrete and bricks and steel and everything you need for infrastructure and city construction, that has overtaken the remaining biomass on our planet. and it's mostly in building construction, the materials with which we build, not the operation and the energy efficiency of buildings, that we accumulate 40% of global carbon dioxide emissions, produce 8% of emissions alone in cement, 14% in steel, 75% of waste globally is produced in cities. So, of course, we could say, in the spirit of last night's neo-conservationism, stop building, but in fact, we have prognosis that 2.5 to 3 billion people will move in cities in the global south, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. So this unprecedented scale and pace of this urban growth will create an enormous demand for more housing and urban infrastructure, which will double the world's building stock and floor area in the coming decades, if this is true. If we continue to build using these kind of strategies, practices, technologies prevalent today, steel and concrete mainly, the environmental and social impacts will be absolutely devastating. So I joined this sort of world of climate science, and which has a kind of language that is quite different from the language we speak. It's a sort of language where we talk about carbon budgets and planetary boundaries, offsetting targets, regulatory guardrails, technological innovation. But it's a language that we all implicitly know through the radio, through media, but somehow we fail to really fully believe in it. It fails to somehow motivate us to do things differently. And in that sense, I think the climate crisis has accurately been described as a sort of crisis of imagination, which partly refers to a breakdown in our ability to grasp the scale, complexity, and true ramifications of our effects on the global climate. But it's also a crisis in our ability to imagine a positive, more hopeful future that could motivate us to engage. To speak of an imaginary is to speak of shared visions to enable collective action, our dream of a good future, but also our role in the process of attaining that future. And Davudi says, which I like, to imagine is to think about possibilities other than possible, times other than now, places other than here. Or it is clearly difficult, if not impossible, to fight for deep systemic changes if we cannot first imagine them. And the larger the systems level change required, the more critical it is to engage society's full collective radical imagination to envision it. So, and falling in a sense onto the floor, surrounded by these researchers that work in quantitative ways and things that I was not familiar with, and waking up in that kind of cold world, the first thing we pretty much did at Bauhaus Earth was to assemble a bunch of colleagues from around the globe, such as Monica Tanuhandaru from Indonesia, who's an activist and environmentalist, or Ana Maria Duran from Ecuador, who is an architect anthropologist, to really put together a kind of a manifesto, which is not something you're supposed to do as an academic, but freed from that baggage of having to produce academic papers, that seemed the right thing to do, to somehow lay out a vision how we would imagine a kind of built environment to change. And what role architects, planners could have in that. So it is called the Towards Re-Entanglement, a charter for the city and the earth. Rather pathetically, you could say. It was also launched in the Vatican and Rome last year. And it probably hasn't made that big of a difference because you haven't heard of it yet, but wait for it. And I just quickly, really, if I still have 2 minutes, I quickly want to just introduce 4 themes that underpin the thinking behind this manifesto, because I think they resonate in the way we have framed the problem, and also in the way I've seen in so many talks, and this is what I found so exciting, ways to imagine things otherwise, not just the dystopian trajectory, and seeing beginnings of a kind of vision. So it begins with the city, of course anchored in a belief in cities as being not just the biggest driver of anthropogenic disturbance, but also in a sense place of creativity, hope, and reimagining. And then has as a central kind of topic this idea about re-entanglement with nature, and sort of looking at this sort of disturbed human nature or nature-culture relationship as really one of the root causes of our crisis. And quickly, and the first principle, we have then 12 principles, and the first says invest in nature. Nature is the existential infrastructure of life on Earth, including human life, and the only solution to heal the planetary crisis. We must seek out, learn from, and invest in the profound intelligence and enduring lessons that a healthy biosphere can offer us. There can be no investment in cities, whether intellectual, spiritual, political, social, or economic, without a corresponding, coordinated, and continually renewed investment in the natural systems that surround and suffuse us. Ecosystemic well-being, which includes humanity but is not limited to our species, must be understood as a basic right of all citizens and the organisms that contribute to the health of our terrestrial metabolisms. So this was the first thinking about nature, which really thinks about re-entanglement of natural and anthropogenic systems, of scales, of timelines, overlapping, contingent, continuously evolving systems that are bounded not by administrative lines on a map, but by the extents of their spheres of influence. So if I give a very practical example, if you think, for instance, about Berlin, Berlin-Brandenburg, we all know that it is shaped by this sort of absurd, very particular histories, of course, East-West divisions, but that now a sort of bizarrely delineated administrative boundary that divides the city and all its bunch of decision makers and governance levels sharply from actually the hinterland and the region of Brandenburg. So we are thinking more about re-entanglement with nature also as a spatial figure, which has a kind of spatial quality and a set of dynamically changing sort of territories. And this territory is the second principle, which has been used a lot in the CRC and has, I think I found this quite interesting in the conference, has been sort of questioned maybe as a sort of figure that we in the CRC understood very much in this sort of modernist tradition as a container for the deployment of state power, and in transformation to sustainability debates linked to specific political jurisdictions such as nation states or administrative boundaries of cities. And this also for planning means that you cannot really embrace actually the meaningful kind of interrelationships and dependencies that are important to take into view and to understand the complex systemic flows of materials, resources, humans, non-human species that make our habitats. So we need a radically different understanding of territory if we want to work with that. And I'm with Marcella and others in the room that have maybe instead, I say it in my words, argued that this figure, a spatial anchor, can actually really help us to see what is not joined up and what is not connected because our complex kind of social systems prevent us from seeing it. So very practically as an architect, I would say, or planner, seeing city and countryside as opposites. Human settlements, spaces of post-Anthropocene future should be understood as part of the ecosystems that surround them and permeate them. We are embedded in and depend on spatial systems with limited available material resources, and instead of continuously extracting resources from the system and polluting it with waste, our action must be directed towards making a positive or regenerative contribution. So in this sense, territory, I think, should be maybe more productively understood as a spatially anchored dynamic network of agents and activities rather than a container. It becomes a powerful and flexible framework in that way for action. It embraces complexity rather than flattening it out for the sake of administrative or forms of legibility, and opens the way for new approaches to the materials with which we will need to house the world's exploding urban populations. So thinking across these kind of urban-rural binaries opens up these kind of possibilities to re-regionalize material flows and value chains, which is something we are really concerned about at Bauhaus Earth, to prioritize bio-based products that are regionally sourced over extractive materials, or to unlock tremendous potentials for decarbonization or even carbon storage in cities by bringing carbon storing materials regionally sourced into cities. And the last point is regenerativity, which I also heard in several contributions, which I find a really important figure to think further, which comes out of this understanding of territory. So we are thinking about sort of regenerative landscapes as a building block for a climate imaginary that is positive, action-oriented, and inclusive. So these regenerative landscapes maybe we can understood as entangled territories, as complex multidimensional systems with shifting and amorphous edges that Donna Haraway might refer to as tentacular. Regenerative landscapes and territories that don't flatten complexity and in their beautiful messiness could represent a state of rich entanglement and a potential answer to the, as Dawoodi writes, crisis of imagination, which is intrinsically connected to the destabilization of the modernist and Enlightenment tenets that have shaped our relationship with the world. So I think I should leave it like that. I probably used up my time. I just wanted to say that this sort of thinking, I think what is required really for my profession, the practicing kind of world of architects, planners, regional planners, is really to maybe do what architects could do best, is to provide a kind of creative visioning, thinking beyond the Anthropocenic trap that we are in, and we are trying to sort of engage with this. There are emerging institutions and organizations and networks that do that with us and without us. And what is also very important is that we actually create sites of proofs of concept where this is possible. So we are trying to really engage with material experimentation, with experimental architecture, with trying to kind of think, what we then should do if we think about in entangled territories, to think about where materials come from, how they enter value chains, how they end up in buildings, what the afterlives of these materials are, how the limited resources that we have in the world could somehow be appreciated and better, more productively engaged with. Yeah, and as I said, maybe later in the discussion, I felt that this sort of thing, I was really happy because I felt in a number of contributions I could see these kind of glimmers of hope, and I think that, I think, if we coordinate ourselves better, also maybe in the CRC, to align our critiques, our kind of imaginaries, I think we could have a fantastic impact, and this is how I really see a kind of productive dialogue between this wonderful bubble of thinking that is in this room and the kind of harsh world of practice. But it requires, in a sense, stepping out of the comfort zone on both sides, which I think is important. Thanks.
Thank you so much for... Thank you so much. And what I've found very interesting is that the criticism on urbanism that you're doing and its inherent modernism that was exported throughout the world has a strong relation to the equally inherent modernism of our spatial figures. And what became quite clear for me during these 2 days is that there are maybe different notions of territory or different notions of territory required or different, probably other spatial figures required. So I would be very curious to hear Martina about, maybe you will react to the planning. I think it's on. It's yeah.
Okay, Philip, I disagree.
It's a discussion. Yeah, how beautiful.
When you say you really wish for a radical other understanding of territory, then I think we're gonna lose this the insight into the powerful inscription what a territory is, into the practice of control and bordering. You are a migration scientist, so you know how terrible territorial organization can be. And I think that, of course, we need a kind of imagination in spatial concepts for for a better world, but I think we have to differentiate between what is and what we wish to be. And the territorial organization is for us an important term to understand this kind of exclusion by bordering and by the practice of closure and homogeneity. I think that's what a territory is. Even if it comes to a playground for kids, it's a territory for special use in the idea of control. And I think when it comes to the imagination of spatial concepts for, let's think about circulation, mobility, and so on, then we need new terms and not the same term in a different way. And I think we never said that it's only the territory. We know that territory is also, or has also, a side of networking. It has also a side of circulation. That is when we have a relation between different figures. But I don't see that it helps us to throw away the territory in the sense of a wishful future.
In the territory, in a sense that we have understood it in the CRC, I would completely agree with. But I just want to sort of somehow kind of acknowledge that there are other ways out there beyond the CRC to use this kind of terminology, which is entirely different. I mean, my world of planning is talking a lot about kind of territorial planning, a territorial turn, even, you know, in a sense of critiquing actually exactly the kind of territorial qualities and character that characterizes our definition of territory. It's a sort of semantic question, but you know, I would be interested to hear what others think. You know, I think that if we, my feeling is that if we only sort of stick with kind of negatively connotated kind of definitions that we don't necessarily share with the outside world, we may not do a kind of good service in actually transferring our thinking to practice, just because the notion is really out there and it's understood differently.
Yeah, the notion of the territory is out there, and it's still is codified in law. And even if you may find another notion of territory, it's still might be very real in its consequences. But I'm curious what.
Well, this is very interesting to me, because I used to study hackers. That was the thing I did for a while. Sezgin's my hacker friend. Berlin's a great place to study hackers. And maybe rather than the figure of the territory, the attention should shift to the figure of planning. Because when there are alternatives to that practice, right? I think coming from within planning is one way to think about it, but also thinking about other figures for that. And hacking might be one of them. And so what you were talking about just now reminded me of an example of what I think of as a kind of interesting way of hacking planning law in Los Angeles, which I don't think is going to be successful, but it's an interesting case, which is that the planning department has a set of rules for how they declare the use of land, and there's a debate about how they're going to declare something as a ecologically sensitive area or an ecologically protected area. Now, there are sort of two ways on the table to do it. One is humans get around a map, and in a planning discourse, they designate which areas will be protected. The other, which is very interesting, is that if something has ground cover or a certain kind of green space in it, it triggers its own protection, right? So if you could pass a law that said at a certain level of ground cover or tree cover, you trigger protection here, you automatically transfer agency to something other than human decision making. Now, this is ingenious, but of course, politically, it's very difficult to get past the developers in Los Angeles, right? But that kind of thinking, to me, seems to be counter in some ways to modernist planning, which still seems so embedded, even in this day and age of cities that are unplannable, and to a great extent unplanned. There's a lot of anthropological work on this, for instance. Jim Holston's work is a great example. So, that to me seems like the nexus for thinking about these issues here is what are the alternatives to planning?
And also, as I think you built yourself a beautiful pass or overpass to the next section and the next question, and asking ourselves how spatial thinking contributes to the idea of the Anthropocene, and maybe we could just continue with your statement if you.
Well, I'm not sure I have a lot to say about this. It's an interesting question how spatial thinking contributes to the understanding of the Anthropocene. I'm not sure there's a shared definition of the Anthropocene at this conference. I think there's some people with very strong ideas about what it is, and then there's a lot of like, well, it's our modern or current condition, our contemporary condition, right? With elements of nature, the environment as one component of it, with elements of climate change, with elements of mass extinction. There's sort of many different things going on in the concept of the Anthropocene. One thing maybe is, and a lot of people I think have been pointing to something like this, which is the sort of irony of recognizing a planetary crisis is that it comes to rest in every place in its own way, right? So, instead of there being climate change, which is the same for everyone and everyone suffers from climate change, it produces inequality everywhere and everywhere differently, right? And that means I think that, a lot of the questions people have been raising about particular places and particular sites probably ought to be taken more seriously, right? That this is a challenge to the way that we think about generalizability or the relationship between universal concepts and specific cases, right? There's really, I think at that level, the Anthropocene is a challenge to that way of thinking and a different way of thinking about spatial figures that doesn't privilege that relationship between the special case and the universal concept might be what it could offer to thinking the Anthropocene, right? And I think that's, I hear that, for instance, like in Thomas's presentation in Peru, where I kept thinking this is so interesting to me because there are all these elements of that story that I can see versions of in Los Angeles, right? There are sort of ecological, indigenous, hydrological, mountainous relations, but they're all very different and they're configured in different ways. And a classical approach would be simply comparison between those two places, right? But maybe the Anthropocene demands a different way of connecting those two things in our analysis. And I was going to go through an example from LA, but basically, I won't go through it in detail. I mean, LA has a river. Not everybody knows this, including many people who live in LA, which we've concreted in. And you've seen it in movies like The Terminator. So we have, this sort of hydrological problem in our city, which is that we did this in order to prevent flooding that was normal flooding. It was flooding that happened every year. And we kind of covered over the wetlands as a result, right? And then, with the Anthropocene, there's all these questions about how to change that, right? How to undo that mistake, which looks so absurd in hindsight, in retrospect to people. And yet, it's all built up, right? Now we have a serious problem of protecting people from flooding, and this concrete river is what's doing it. At the same time that it's pouring all the water we should be saving out into the ocean, destroyed the wetlands, which would otherwise help us do that, and becomes this like incredible site also of planning and design. Frank Gehry's involved, it's this whole fraught set of relationships in that case. And so I guess the question is, how does the Anthropocene change this case, right? Or how does spatial thinking about different figures change the way we think about it? And I think one answer to that is that it really depends on who your position, from which position you see it, right? So if you're a, developer, it's one kind, it's a kind of question of developers looking at it, insurers and investors looking at it, residents looking at it, but without just turning them into stakeholders or interests, right? Taking seriously that the relationships that exist for those diverse groups of people are real worlds, right? Real worlds with real consequences, and not just a set of interests that need to be balanced between. And that's a very challenging problem, which I think we don't have good language for in a planning context, in a governmental context, but also maybe in a scholarly context. One way I think this became clear to me in listening to people's talks here is, to some extent, it was in Alexandra's maps of the critical zone, right? This sense that we are producing this extremely rich scientific language of understanding how the critical zone works and how all of the processes are going to be connected to each other in the name of recognizing climate change as a threat, but also in the name of making it the threat to the world, right? As opposed to something much more multiplicitous, right? Multiplicitous? Am I speaking English anymore? Multiple, let's just say multiple. You know, if, you know, this comes home, I think, in the case of the indigenous critiques of the Anthropocene and climate change, which have come up here in multiple cases, right, where the response to climate change, alarmism, or apocalypticism on the part of indigenous activists is generally welcome to the club, right? Like, we have been experiencing climate change and the Anthropocene for 500 years in the North American context. So now you've joined us, right? Which is an interesting way of asserting that there's a world that's been disrupted there, which is not the world, right? And I think that tension is what, for me, is at the heart of what these spatial figures should be aiming at, maybe, in an analytic sense. But I don't think I have an answer for how to push that further. I'm new here.
Thank
I'll
you.
stop here.
Yeah, just since this panel discussion should also serve to wrap up, or just to remind us what we heard, I would say that can we think of the Anthropocene without spatial categories? I would not say so, but at the same time we are creating a world. We are creating a notion of the global, which is of course also a result of tremendous social work. And I remember the slight discussion between I think Gaston and Ignacio about the terrain, and whether the terrain is something that is, or to which extent the notion of the terrain is something more than human, or something that is moved by a human. So I think to make matters worth, not only Anthropocene and spatial theory, but also to think about what is the human and the non-human contribution to these notions. Would you react?
I mean, with my practice hat on, I mean, I think that you know, I love our spatial figures, and they help to really penetrate through these anthropogenic crisis and name dynamics and abstract them. But in order to think beyond, as a practical planner, I would you know, be tasked with the kind of question, well, how could Berlin somehow become a kind of net zero, convivial kind of city, living with the resources that are fairly much surrounding it? It's a very practical question. You know, making sure that Brandenburg doesn't end up as a desert, completely void of any kind of biodiversity. I mean, we are edging towards a real system collapse at a kind of local scale. And I mean, spatial figures would help me to understand a lot of things that are wrong, but somehow how to rejoin or reassemble, in a sense, a convivial relationship between humans and nature, this kind of a practical world. You know, these spatial figures for me are not really the beginning of the solution. And that's what I'm kind of slightly struggling with, because we have used them as a kind of device for critiquing, which is very important. It's the beginning of thinking around other imaginaries. But, you know, I still find it difficult to kind of, you know, well, Berlin is a bad example because it's just so behind in any kind of progressive thinking at the city level. But let's say Aachen, there are other cities in Germany. I mean, we need somehow find languages and concepts to help kind of actually creating very practical change on the ground. I'm not saying that this is the only purpose of theorizing, but I think somehow I'm looking for ways from the practice side, really how also the CRC and these kind of spatial figures could actually become the beginnings of imaginaries, climate imaginaries for more convivial futures.
Wow, that would be quite something if our spatial figures
Can I ask
could
a
do
question?
this.
I mean, this is really, I sense your, I mean, I appreciate the struggle that you're performing for us here. Just one question. Does it make sense to ask about imagining the past as well as imagining the future here? And if so, is that a way forward? In a lot of places, that's an important story. In Los Angeles, it's really strong because we're very good at forgetting things. I think Berlin is kind of the opposite in that sense. There's an interesting comparison to be made there. But nonetheless, imagining the past means imagining it otherwise for the purposes of a convivial city. And I wonder if that makes sense as a challenge.
Martina, do you want to respond to this, or should we continue with the statement?
Yeah, just one sentence. It's not only imagining or forgetting the past, it's also the reinvention of the past, which is important in that point.
Okay, then we would continue with the most important question, I would say. How does this, what we did the past 2 days, contribute to further develop spatial theory and further develop the notion of what is essential for the CRC, the spatial figures, and to which extent are they contested in the Anthropocene? And I'm very curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would like to share 3 thoughts with you. One is on refiguration, the next one is on space, and the third one is on spatial figures. And refiguration is for us a term, an alternative term for social change, which is not so progressing, which is more spatial, which has, as a refiguration, does not include the idea of healing. It is full of contradictions, tensions, fusions. It's about non-simultaneity. And I think the discussion about the Anthropocene helps us to think this instability, to think about disaster, to think about disposition as part of social change, and also the handling of disaster and the handling of instability. I think we should really go to the point that refiguration means that one status of tension changes to another status of tension, so that we really start or go further to include the destruction into the idea of social quality and the new dimensions of social quality. I think it maybe sounds easy, but it's really difficult to think that refiguration means to handle catastrophe, destruction. And not only that we think about, for example, when we focus on conflicts, what we do right now in this phase of the CRC, that we not only talk about conflicts with ecology, but also conflicts caused by fire, by wind, by animals, so that we really get to this point that we can include this dystopic moments into the idea of refiguration. And that is when I say it's caused, for example, by animals, conflicts. Yeah, then it's not a question of guilty, of course not. It's that we think about the active parts coming from this kind of dimensions, creatures, and so on. And I think this has also some kind of results or some kind of provocations regarding our definition of space. We always think that space is an relational arrangements of living beings and social goods, or sometimes we name it objects. And I think in this kind of definition we include animals and plants, for examples, but the language is not really precise when we talk about objects to cover the dimension of wind and fire or clouds. These ideas or these phenomena which are so much about circulation and mobility, but also about phenomena which are not under human control. This is something we really have to integrate into our idea of space, or to include better into the idea of space. And when I say without human control, then I mean as well phenomena which never had been under control of human beings, or phenomena where we lost control, which of course is a difference, but I think we have to think in both directions. And when it comes to the four figures, I think more or less they work. Silke and Ignacio introduced the four figures with a strong emphasis on history of world making and with this distinctive logics which gives us the chance to differentiate between these figures. And I also thought, as maybe Philip mentioned, or Silke mentioned that in her question, that we should be more open for different use of figures in different contexts. So, for example, the use of territory in different contexts. And one of our questions should be, how do people use this, and what are the differentiations we can draw? So you mentioned, for example, that we see a different use of the term territory in different disciplines. Silke mentioned that there might be a different use in different cultures, and I think we should think about that, not only regarding territory, also regarding place, regarding what we called root in this conference and network. But maybe territory is the most difficult term for us. And I used to say territorial space, not territory, to avoid this very strong notion of the nation state, that we are more open for all the concepts of closure and bordering and so on. And I see that it's somehow a basic category for all the concepts who work in a colonial and post-colonial context, and I think there is a very strong power in this category of territory. But of course, I'm also interested in a Latin American feminist use of territory as a category of empowerment. For me, as an open question at the moment is, in a quite Foucaultian sense, if the category and the counter use of the category maybe shares the same basic assumptions. So they refer to the same structures when we use territory, for example, in post-colonial context as a category of critique, and we use it in a feminist context as a category of empowerment. It's maybe the same semantic scheme which is different from place and different from networks, and that we should be open for to understand the different uses, but we should also think about basic differentiations, basic spatial differentiations. And for me, and I think we should put aside to the figures other spatial concepts. And I think the mimetic concept could be an important part. Mimetic can be part of every spatial figure, I suppose, and I would like to think more about that. And I thought a lot about the concept of niche, because, you know, I said it's relational, it's embracing diversity, and I wonder if it might be a positive outlook for place. You know what happened when we had these different lectures? Only in the session of place, both speakers spoke about the crisis of place. We didn't talk about the crisis of the network or the crisis of the root. We spoke about the crisis of place. And I thought maybe niche is somehow what Philip looks for, this kind of positive outlook, yeah? If the catastrophe of place comes to an end, maybe the niche is the solution. And that leads me to the idea or to the question if we should give figures a career. Yes, something where they can develop to. And that's exactly the point where I thought maybe terrain is a positive outlook for territory, but I'm not sure. I mean, terrain is also a very difficult category, but just to share this with you, that from place to niche, from territory to terrain, and then it comes to root. And root is really, I have to share a contradiction with you, which is a contradiction within the CRC. In German, the category we are talking about is Bahnenraum. And we always fight about the translation of this term. And I normally use trajectoral space, and sometimes I say trajectory. And Silke and Ignacio, they spoke about root. And when I listened to Andrew, what I heard was it's the law of the father, it's stratification, it's submission, and so on. And so I thought maybe the root could develop to the trajectory, because the trajectory follows the object, and the root is built into the ground. It's about, you know, it's this very strong side of bringing a line to the ground, and the trajectory follows the object. And you know what? When it comes to network, I'm tracked. I don't have a positive outlook for network. And I think that is because we already have a positive idea of the network. We are not able to see the exclusion by territory and the very bad modern part of it. So we are always already on the other side. And last but not least, I was also wondering how it comes that, for example, the fire, the wind comes along with the territory, but with no other figure. And the animals, they come with the root, for example. And so there might be always a medium of observation. And somehow I think that these kind of media are different regarding the different figures, And that could be also a point where we could delve deeper into to think about how do we mediatize different figures, and what are the perspectives we use to understand the figure, and could we bring the fire also to the place and the animals to the territory and so on. So to mix the perspectives and to widen the perspective by that.
Thank you very much. I think this sounds like the Anthropocene thinking fruitfully irritated our spatial figures. But at the same time, I liked your idea or the observation that it's maybe not the figures themselves that are changing in the Anthropocene, but the function and how they are used, whether a place is being used as a for a community as a place of resistance, if territory is used in a similar fashion. So the observation would be, can it be that not the figures are changing, but maybe their function? But that's would be another question. I would give you too also the possibility to react, and especially since the niche, since Chris introduced the niche to us, so maybe you want to add something on this, or equally.
It's just it's really wonderful to listen to, Martina. This live thinking that you are sharing with us. And I'm fully with you in trying to kind of think about ways in which spatial figures could adopt other lives or other kind of impacts. But I'm just remaining sort of slightly worried that if we get too hung up about terms, that we close ourselves too much in a hermetic sort of theorizing system, which I know you sociologists love to do. I'm fully admiring of it. My intellectual capacity lets me down, but I just think we need to be curious and open towards the world out there, which is changing, and we shouldn't squeeze it into our theory. And I think the dynamics, the qualifying what we mean, can be more, and putting the emphasis on these kind of qualities and underpinning dynamics, rather than just the temptation of ending up with a summary of 4 terms, or 5 or 6. So sometimes I think we fully agree on that, but thanks, Martina.
No, I don't have more to say, except that trajectory is an interesting parallel to pathway, in the sense that it opens up this question of the reversibility or irreversibility of that in a temporal sense, whereas a route can be, as Andrew pointed out, this very straight, static-looking line that doesn't seem to have a direction to it, and that's useful. I also wanted to point out that in terms of the 4 figures and your anxiety about, not anxiety, your attention to control, it's only place that really is not obviously about control. The other 3 very clearly are. And it might be worth thinking through figures that proliferate from place that are not about control, or versions of those other 3 figures which are about resistance. And I think that's where Marcelin's talk comes in, and a few other interventions around some of these figures, that there are maybe counterfigures within them that emphasize resistance as opposed to control.
All right. So now I would say it's time to open the discussion to the audience. I think this have been very rich statements from each of you, and yeah, if there are any questions, Hubert, of course.
I would just link to the last statement, Philip, you made about the changes we are living through. I mean, that's exactly why we suggest the refiguration, because we had different words for that, like globalization, which don't work out anymore. And I wonder, that's exactly why we think about that. It's not just we suffer the changes, but we need, of course, and it's our task to understand the changes. And the refiguration is just one of the ideas to do that. And the idea, of course, the next step of it has been that's to do with the figures. The question is, first of all, I think this would helpful even be for you, because where does it go to? That's one of the major questions I think you will be asking. And in order to answer this question, you have to have an idea of what changes are going on. The second point I would even to ask Martina, it sounds as if there are figures. And in fact, the figures are just conceptions, of course. We are having spatial conceptions. And it seems as if the figures are just there. Whereas I think the idea is always that it's figures which are realized, enacted, which are part of action, materialized in things, be it by animals, be it by humans. So it's things which are part of processes. And the processes are creating them. And I think that's an interesting connection to the Anthropocene. If we are not ontologizing the figures, but saying the figures are ways. There have been ways of spatial acting, which have been producing the Anthropocene, which have been sedimenting materially by the path, for example. Your path is an example. The root is an example for that, which is produced. We have also from the other paper by routinization, for example. So in the sense, I would even think that the question of the kind of figures dominating in the creation of the Anthropocene, even an understanding of that, which is created in action, which is the Anthropocene didn't come about, created in action by humans. That's the very idea. So it's actually the social and material construction of the globe. That's what we're talking about. And the figures are an idea, that's what Martina said, to grasp it spatially, very abstractly. But then globalization has been very abstract, and it did work. Badly, but it did work. Has been a question.
Does anybody want to react to Hubert's vivid... Okay, no reactions? Then Sung, please.
Thank you for this very intriguing discussions. I'm really wondering how you all caught up so much from these 2 days of discussions and presentations, because wow. I'm looking back on the first day of our 2 days of conference, and what really caught my mind was how the human-made kind of borders between the nature and civilization is unsettled through this climate change and crisis that it causes. For instance, like wildfire in Canada or all over the world. And also, those are like, for me, small pieces of puzzles. I also heard from several colleagues of mine that those 2 days were very much of cultural studies. What I'm thinking is, I'm just thinking out loud, please excuse me, bringing Anthropocenic thinking to our research context makes me wonder, where is the society? Because for me, it has been, the spatial figures have been societal constructs in human-made environments, more or less, or how people make use of space, or how people think through those spatial figures or create these spatial figures all over the world, but mostly in human-made environments. But when I look at wildfire and how it easily unsettles the national boundaries on the one hand, but on the other hand, then again through communication acts, this border was again reinforced through this media campaign from the US, for instance. It's just my general question: where is the society in the Anthropocenic thinking? Yeah.
Quite similar, and we had the discussion also about talking about the terrain, whether to which extent the terrain needs to be produced socially, of course. Do you wanna react, or does anybody want to react? Does anybody from the audience want to react? Or okay, if not, then Claudia, please. Claudia Mock.
I don't have to react, right? I can ask my question. Yeah, I wonder what happened to scale, because as I understood it right, not everyone is starting from a flat ontology. Like, there's also others who argue probably that this wouldn't be a good point of departure. And also how it relates at the end to, or how, I mean, we realize, or we say that spatial figures might be helpful to understand Anthropocene situations, or but how about scale? That kind of fell out of the focus. Is it a spatial figure, or what is it?
Okay, for me, it's not a spatial figure. I mean, you know that for some, like Brenner, it is, but I think scale is a mode of synthesizing. And I think that when it comes to scale, we quite often have this debate that someone talks about the global scale and then the next person adds, but the global is always local, and it's always related, these different scales, to each other. And I think thinking of figures can help us to realize that scale is in every figure, that place is, like Dorian Massey says, local and global at the same time. And this is also true, of course, for territory. This is also true for trajectories. And I think when we start to understand the world by using concepts of spatial figures, then we can investigate in every single study about a spatial figure also the scaling dimension as a specific principle to synthesize objects, human beings, living beings, creatures, to space in different scaling dimensions. So that is the simple answer to put scale on the side of synthesize and figure as an alternative thinking to scaling.
I'll just add that one of the first papers, one of my first and best unpublished papers was about scalability, because it's a figure in the internet as a feature of what it means to be big and small at the same time, kind of being like being local and global at the same time. But in this case, it's a marketing term, kind of like what Jennifer was showing us today, right? These, and this was particularly strong in the 90s, but it's still part of internet business plans today, and which has spread into lots of other areas, right? This sense that growing really fast is the goal, right? That's what makes capitalism of the contemporary moment distinctive from other kinds or moments of capitalism. And that use of scalability or scaling, you know, it's a verb as opposed to a noun, right? Strikes me as something that the figure of the network really needs to work through, because the network is not just nodes and ties connecting individuals, it's also this machine for producing scalability or for scaling things. And that might be, you know, in terms of doing work on the network, thinking through the scalability there might be different.
I would agree that in this kind of world of solution building, which I represent here happily, you know, somehow scale is used in terms of economy of scale and kind of in a very kind of capitalist kind of logic. And nevertheless, I think that you probably introduced this from a completely different perspective, so we're drifting. But when we we find a more productive kind of maybe terminology is to talk about replicability or transferability of certain situations, certain learnings across geographies or across topics, and I think we shouldn't lose that potential at all.
Right, René Tuma. René in the back.
Yeah, when we open up the space, so to say, for new figures, we have been thinking in our project, because you also mentioned the internet debates, and the scale is one thing. In the internet debates, there is the concept of the stack, where you have like this ranging from the very physical layer to the network layer, application layer, and so on to the user basically. So and down there is the physical, and then on top you have and you can criticize that, of course. And there is one author, Benjamin Bratton, who has used this and extended it in a very speculative way to also including the more even basic, the earth layer and so on, and also including the Anthropocene in a way into that. And I was just wondering whether anyone has any ideas about that, of taking that up, because it's in a way like the scale, but it has this different qualities of those different layers. So I think that's a thing that might help us to connect different logics that are interwoven and interlinked and have conflicts on different layers, so to say, of the stack.
I've never been this self-aggrandizing in my life, I have to say, but I did write a book about something called a recursive public, which is basically the same idea as the stack, right? But focusing on the question of how moving between those layers is the important one, not the fact of there being a kind of spatial stack of different areas, but that in order to control one layer, one has to investigate a layer beneath it. And in order to do that, one has to investigate a layer beneath that. But you can't just keep going. You have to make a decision to stop at some point. And that's the important question about politics and the internet, I think, is not just that there's this, core sample that goes down to the bottom, but rather that there's a kind of active, practical intervention going on with that kind of thinking. So.
Just one more comment, and I know that maybe my contributions sit a little bit odd here, but I mean, in this world of kind of carbon reduction and net zero kind of discussions, there is this sort of terminology of different scopes, scope 1, 2, 3 of carbon emissions, and which somehow relate to scale, I think, and the difficulty with which to actually think across different scales. Cities are not certainly not mandated, but also not able and capacitated to think about scope 3 emissions, everything that we externalize in these very destructive dynamics. So I think there is a kind of crisis and conflict here in our language. And we may see these kind of interrelation, but in terms of translating this into actually practical action, this is, I think, the crux of much of the problem that we're facing.
There was another, yeah, you, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to make a brief remark as an art historian, not just a random guest, but when I listen to terms like the figure, the niche, also the scale, I just wanted to say it might be interesting also to take these words back, like historically wise, and see where they're from, how they're rooted. Because if you take the scale, and I also think that scale is always scaling as a practice. It could be a measure, it could be some stuff, like something that gives you a certain norm, and then you put like materialized scale. But what we refer to usually when we say scale is scaling. And that has a tradition very long ago in the idea of the connection between the micro and the macrocosm. So there is the promise that, in a nutshell, the entire world is somehow included. And if you project it to a bigger scale, then you can have this entire microcosm on a bigger level, or vice versa. Like the entire cosmos is in us or on this planet somewhere. And this promise of scalability then led to the development of optical media, or made it even possible to think that, but through a lens you can see the entire world and vice versa. And that was ideologically very important. So it is an ideological term. It is a promise of scalability and reappears in the term of microcomputing. So even that, like in this little circuit you have everything, and so on and so forth. So there is a certain logic, and if you read it in this historical logic, then you read it also in terms of, I don't know, industrialization, development of media, etc., which is slightly different than in other, let's say, spheres or disciplines where you can also find these words, but they will have a completely different context. So I would find it as an art historian, very important always to say, like, from what kind of historical angle I introduce these terms, like the niche, which is an important religious thing, like in catacombs, but there it has a slightly different meaning than in the ecological niche. So that's what I just want to say. They are related, of course. But I find it very fascinating to listen to what Martina Löw said, because I think that's exactly it, to see that these terms have like a double, doppelten Boden, like double ground.
To consider the etymology of the words and the history. Do you want to react? Or?
For figure, it's very important for us to do this, especially the differentiation between figure and form, because form is the most static term in history, especially in philosophy, and forma and figura is the more flexible one. So we wanted to include flexibility, but also corporality into the term which we use to differentiate spatial arrangements, and that's why we ended up with figure or figura. Yeah, but I appreciate your additional comments. Thank you very much.
So I think the next one was Ignacio, and then we have one. Okay, one. Two.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for all the reactions to the symposium. It's been really wonderful to listen to you now. So I just wanted to go back to kind of the I think very interesting suggestion of Martina concerning how to give the figures a life, a biography, kind of, give them a life. And to think about these sort of tensions, right? How they might evolve, how they might project themselves into something else, how they might transform, get defigured and refigured, as we were also saying, right? But I was, and I like this kind of idea of thinking about the more, let's say, and I think we also introduced that a little bit with this idea of the modernist and kind of sort of negative connotation of control and so on, and then to think like how to reverse that. But I was also wondering to what extent this tension between, let's say, territory and terrain, for example, or place and niche, I think this is also very interesting. Maybe it has another, perhaps more profound or not more theoretical sort of level, which has to do with how we think of space as well, right? Because it seems to me that what has happened in the last, well, I don't know, decades in spatial theory is some sort of topological turn where a lot of debates about space are inspired by topology. And this is a specific type, topology is a very specific way of thinking relationality. So it's a type of relationality that is sort of very abstract in a way. So it's about how elements relate to each other in an abstract space, and that's why we can take a needle and take it and transform it into a donut, and it's the same topological figure. So topology is a very abstract way of approaching relationality. And my feeling is that this positive side of the figures, or this debate that we've been having and the talks that we've been listening to, approach relationality from a more, I don't know if this is an opposition, but from a more ecological sort of approach, where the relationality of that ecology tends to imagine is also about the limits of relationality and how things live and die and how so impossibility. And it's a lot about also about coexistence. So basically, multiple things just side on side and not necessarily co-functioning. So in topology, we are thinking about how things constitute each other, right? And in ecology, that's also relevant. But there is also coexistence, like being co-placed in the same, and relations of irritation just by being together on the same spot, so to speak. So I wonder whether we are like also, whether like taking into account all these anthropocenic things, the disruption provoked by the Earth and the geos and Gaia, whatever we call it, might also change also the way we think about relationality vis-a-vis spatial theory, and invite us to move from a more topological approach to a more, let's say, ecological approach of conceiving space. And that could also, for example, allow us to include what you said, the fires and the winds and all these things which are not objects, which are not either entities, because either human or objects is all entities. So how do we include how do we go beyond the entity sort of ontology of topological spatial theory? Sorry, a bit long.
Thank you. There was a question by Marcella.
It's also more a remark. I just want to say also thank you for this great discussion. And I want to do a remark about the territory, because there is a differentiation but between empowerment and resistance. And when these collectives are talking about territory, is first to recognize that this is a space of control, the corporative and governmental control. And because of that, there is resistance. There is a counterweight because these collectives have agency, have strategies that is really different from empowerment. So adding to Ignacio's proposal, the coexistence, how these strategies coexist. Okay, the territory is a really space of control, but it's also this control also is the source of the resistance in different ways. So yeah, I'm also in the coexisting debate, so thank you.
Thank you. There was another comment by Stefan Kirchner. I'm sorry, yeah.
No, I actually wanted to ask a very similar question to what Ignacio asked. So Martina, you just said that we have to include fire and as wind in our understanding ideal space, a relation arrangement. So I wanted to ask if you could comment a little bit more on that, or maybe also the others if they wanted to add some comments on that. And I was thinking also, we talked about fires and borders, but fires are some kind of event that exists in a certain time. But what about, for instance, heat that is a little bit more elusive, both temporally and spatially? If you had some comments about that.
As far as I see the spatial theory, which is quite a sociological way of thinking, we started from the point that we really wanted to develop a term or an understanding of space in a relational way. And then it was so difficult to deal with the fact that space is social and material at the same moment. And all our thoughts went in the direction to integrate materiality into the thinking about society and to bring the social into the thinking of space. And I think now we are at a point where we develop spatial theories which are quite good in explaining social, spatial existence. But now we have a new challenge, and this is to grasp phenomena which are not objects and not human beings and not living beings. And this, for example, is wind or fire. And I think what we have in spatial theory is an idea of atmosphere. Atmosphere as a result of the influence of objects and at the same time the act of perception. So in the combination of both, we can find something what we call atmosphere. And heat is maybe close to what we see when we talk about atmosphere. But there is still this challenge of a differentiation between moving phenomena like clouds and the establishment of atmosphere. And that's a point where I think we should have, we should think about that, we should discuss about that, we should have it as a topic in the CRC to develop this kind of theory building further.
Okay, there was another question, comment by Stefan.
Comment, question. Okay. Let's see how it works. Yeah, many thanks. I really enjoyed the discussion, and also you got me there with the mountain lion. This was awesome. So I just wanted to add 2 points to the discussion we already had, connecting to the point where is the society, right? I was wondering whether this huge task, already huge task of the spatial figures, the huge task about the spatial figures gets even huger with the Anthropocene and whole climate crisis. But I was also thinking how to approach this and how to get society in. And it seems to me that major problems we are facing with the aspects you brought up, Philip, is that we have global inequalities we have to handle and we have to cope. But it seems to me that for many societies, it's very local inequalities that gridlock the current debates and make it difficult to move forward. So I was wondering what you think about that it's very difficult to move like 20 kilometers from here and find people that would agree with the position we would probably agree all in this room. So this would be adding to the question where the society is, what are the conflicts, and where do these conflicts localize, and would it be important to add very local conflicts to the global nature of the phenomenon we talked about? And the second one is just a minor point, adding to the development of the spatial figures. I also think that we made progress in this conference, and I was starting to think about that these figures might be furnished, adding to the idea of the career. So something happens to these figures, they differ, and of course the career of the network is the platform. But what would you say about the different localities of the inequalities? Do they play into overcoming the difficulties to engage with the problems that are ahead? Would you agree? Would you disagree?
Well, maybe on that last question, I mean, if you think about sort of solution building for the climate crisis, I think the crisis is perceived completely differently. If you have conversations in Dar es Salaam or even Cape Town from Berlin, I mean, it's penetrated by these very different kind of roles and responsibilities we have actually in the investment we have at this kind of crisis and causing the crisis. So I think we have, as in industrial countries, that are producing, that have disproportionately, vastly disproportionately contributed to a global crisis, a kind of ethical responsibility to, allow these 2.5 to 3 billion dwellers to build. Although we know that, what I said before, if they build in the way they build now, we will have, climate scientists would calculate this, maybe 3.4 degree global warming. So the conflict that we have, I think, it relates to specific histories, specific investments, legacies of coloniality and post-coloniality. So I think, I think that there's a certain kind of emerging kind of sense of awareness, I think, beyond academic or expert bubbles about ethical responsibility and need for behavioral change. But if you have a conversation, I tried to have that conversation in Dar es Salaam a couple of years ago, and it is very far away. It's something you caused over there. You tidy it up. Just as an example, so I think there's a profound sense of injustice in this, and therefore a different identification with certain kind of ethical responsibilities and responsibilities to act. I don't know, did I answer this a little bit? Or? Yes. Sure.
Than other people around the world. But this seems to be the political problem to solve this, that in a democracy you need majorities, and some people seem to not understand the implications of the problems you raised in your talk, right? Which makes it difficult on a political level to really go forward. I was just thinking that this might add to the problem.
I think we also definitely continue thinking about that, but there are two more questions, and I would like to collect them that they don't get lost, by Gaston and Nina. And so, please.
Yeah, thank you for an amazing panel. It's just a comment on the question of terrain that a couple of people raised. For me, the idea of terrain is another way of thinking about the Earth, about the planet, along the lines of what Andrew mentioned today about this new theorization about planetary thinking that should really go beyond the notion of the planet is something fixed or rigid. Obviously, he emphasized the issue of motion, flows. And to me, the problem with terrain historically, especially the way it's been used by the military, it's associated with rigid forms, and I agree with Martina that the notion of form in philosophy evokes a certain rigidity. But as Deleuze will say, forms are always being unformed and forming it again, and I think for me, terrain is a way to think about the flows of matter in the Earth in a very dynamic way. And also to think about the Earth as a spatial figure for the Anthropocene is another way of undoing the human nature dualism, because we are part of the Earth, all the built environment, all the mess we're created, we are part of this planet. So terrain for me implies going beyond the human, but at the same time coming back to understand humanity within the physicality of the Earth, kind of as a process in motion. But also, as I said in my talk, as something inseparable from places and territories. That's why what I propose is to think these three concepts together. And how they capture different dimensions or moments of our spatial experience on this planet. So just wanted to clarify some of the ways in which I've been thinking about this particular category, terrain.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Nina Meyer, the last question.
Okay, hi. Okay, last question. What an honor. I try to make it short. I have a question for Philip, or maybe it's better, it's for all of you, but it brings us back to Philip's input at the very beginning of this session. And you used this Berlin-Brandenburg example, as we just heard. And one of the things I noticed is when you talked about territory and problematic aspect of the territory is that you pointed out to specific characteristics, namely administrative borders and jurisdiction. And I was just wondering, do you think we consider this enough? Or maybe let me rephrase, would you think it's a fruitful approach to maybe pose the question, how do our legal rules actually work out spatially? Or which spatial figures do our legal rules actually create? Can we imagine them to create different spaces? Because I think this is one way of creating this bordering logic of territory, right? We can look at material aspects, like building a fence around a playground. We can look at technological aspects, trying to use this controlling function of bordering. But aren't these legal systems also frameworks that we should look at, influencing, maybe to connect it to what Hubert Knoblauch said, influencing the ways that spatial figures can actually be produced in action? Yeah, this would maybe be it. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to raise the notion of territory again. I kind of accept my failure to kind of reconnotate it. And I found this discussion very productive and very inspiring that we had since. I think we all agree, that somehow part of our kind of crisis are and inability to act upon what we know is dysfunctional are the sort of, the kind of systems that we lock ourselves in, the social political kind of systems. And cities are for me one. I mean, not the city, the urbanities that we like to talk about, but the cities as very pragmatic kind of jurisdictions with mandates and decision-making powers. And what I mentioned before, the more than half, I mean, this is a figure from climate science, but more than half of the emissions that are produced in cities are not outside of the mandate of cities. So this is just a very simple, very pragmatic kind of, the scope 3. So how do we get there? We just have completely the wrong system. So anything that, I mean, cities have learned to think about water, to think about food, to think about certain kind of flows that are important, sustain them beyond their jurisdiction. And we are, I mean, this is one of our particular missions at Bauhaus Earth, is to sort of somehow fold a kind of material awareness into these things. We've been working in Cape Town, where Cape Town came very, very close to a complete crisis. I mean, it was globally reported on, the water crisis a couple of years ago. And literally the last minute, they managed to in a sense, abandon these sort of tired worlds of mandates and came up with completely different, actually completely informal sort of ways of creating alliances across and creating sort of ways of negotiating about resources which maintained and remained beyond crisis. So I do have hope that somehow maybe through our experience of fire and wind and many worse things that there are to come, that we are forced actually into a creative process of acting and rethinking.
All right. We have to take this as a closing remark for now, because now we are having a break, but there will be something, the book presentation later. Thank you very much, and thank you all for your contributions.